In this video, we're going to talk about congruence and triangles. By the end of this video, you should be able to identify congruent figures and corresponding parts. You should also be able to understand what it takes to prove that two triangles are congruent. So to get us started, we first need to talk about what it means for two figures to be congruent. And in this diagram, we have two quadrilaterals. We have A, B, C, D, and we also have W, X, Y, Z. And the question posed to us is ABCD congruent to WXYZ? And just looking at these two figures, we're likely to say that no, they don't look to be congruent. And if I were to ask you why do they not seem to be congruent, we might start by saying that, well, they first appear to be different sizes. ABCD appears to be much smaller than WXYZ. If we think a little bit more about what it means to be different sizes, that brings us to saying that they appear to have different angle measures. The angles in ABCD appear to be different than those in WXYZ. And going a little bit further, we can say they appear to have different side lengths. The sides making up ABCD appear to be smaller than the sides making up WXYZ. And it's these last two pieces that really tie into what it means for two figures to be congruent. So what does it mean for two or more figures to be congruent to one another? And the answer to this is that when two figures are congruent, their corresponding sides and corresponding angles are congruent. Well, for us to truly understand that, we need to take a look at what are corresponding sides and what are corresponding angles. Looking at this next slide, we have two triangles in this diagram. And we're told that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. So what we're going to do now is we're going to identify the corresponding angles, and we're also going to identify the corresponding sides. And since these triangles are said to be congruent, we know that the angles and sides that correspond to one another are also going to be congruent. So let's take a look at the angles first. We know that angle A and angle X are corresponding, and we know that they're going to be congruent to one another. They both have one tick mark, or pardon me, one arc marking them, meaning that they're congruent. We also see that angle B and angle Y both have two arcs marking them, meaning that they're congruent. Angle C and angle Z have three arcs marking them, so they're congruent to one another. And based off of these arcs, we see which angles are corresponding to one another and that they're going to be congruent to one another as well. Now, looking at the sides, we know that AB and XY are congruent to one another because they each have one tick mark marking them. BC and YZ each have three tick marks marking them, so they're congruent as well. And CA and ZX have two tick marks marking them, meaning that they're congruent. So looking at our statements that we've written, we have three pairs of corresponding sides that are congruent. Now we got this information from the diagram, but if we look at this congruent statement, this gives us all the information that we need to know to answer those questions as well. The first letter in each of the triangle names are A and X. If we look back at our diagram, A and X are corresponding points. B and Y are the second letter in each of the triangle names. And B and Y are corresponding points in our triangles. C and Z are the last letters used in the names for our triangles. And looking at our diagrams, C and Z are both corresponding points. If we didn't have this diagram, we would be able to still list all the angles that are corresponding and all the sides that are corresponding based off of just reading our congruent statement. Now, the last bit is using all this information to help us prove that triangles are congruent. To get us started, we need to be able to identify congruent corresponding parts, and we need to provide a reason for each congruence that we list. In our diagram, we have some given information. We have some tick marks marking segments congruent. We have some boxes marking that we have some right angles, and we also have some arcs marking a pair of congruent angles. But we need to see that all three corresponding sides are congruent to one another, and all three corresponding angle pairs are also congruent to one another. So we can start by saying that RV and ST are congruent. If we look at this diagram, RV is this left side of the rectangle, and ST is the right side. They each have one tick mark, so that means that they're congruent to one another, and that's given to us because it's provided in the diagram. We can also say that RS and VT are congruent because they each have two tick marks marking them, and that was also given to us in the diagram. Which leaves us to the last side. This third side of each triangle, VS and VS, we need to show are congruent to one another. And we can do this because it's the same exact segment. So we can say that SV is congruent to SV because of the reflexive property. The reflexive property says that any segment is congruent to itself. So we can use that to show that SV is congruent to SV. Now we've shown that all three corresponding sides are congruent to one another. We've done half the work that it takes to prove that two triangles are congruent. We now need to move to the angles. We can say that angle VST, this angle right here, is congruent to SVR, this angle right here, because they each have one arc, and that was given to us. So we can say that they're congruent. We can also say that angle VTS and angle SRV are congruent. They both have the boxes in them, which means that they're right angles. And because all right angles are congruent, we can say that those two angles are congruent to one another. This leaves us at the third angle. We need to show that angle RSV is congruent to angle TVS, this angle over here. And we can do this because of a theorem that's called the third angle theorem. So if we've already shown that 2 out of 3 angles are congruent to 2 out of 3 angles of another triangle, then that last angle has to be congruent to the last angle of the other triangle. So we can now say that RSV is congruent to SVT based off of the third angle theorem. Now, if we want to arrange this into a proof, all that we need to do is to first get our statements and reasons column going. And then we can move the statements that we've created to our statements and reasons. So listing the givens that we were provided to us in the diagram. We can arrange those. And then we can start talking about the other segment congruence and angle congruences that we found based off of our properties, theorems, and any definitions that we had. So looking at this, we've proven that 3 pairs of corresponding segments are congruent and 3 pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. We're able to say that triangle RSV is congruent to triangle TVS. Now, if this were a formal proof, we'd have to go ahead and write all of our numbers for the statements and corresponding reasons, and we should also finish this by saying that triangle RSV is congruent to triangle TVS. But this wasn't a formal proof, so we can get by with this. Now, that pretty much concludes what we're talking about in terms of congruence and triangles. So let's finish with a joke. And our joke is, Why wasn't there any food left after the monster party? Drum roll. Well, there wasn't any food left after the monster party because everyone was a goblin.